Hello, and well, welcome to what will definitely not be going up on time because I'm re-recording this at literally 6:30. Because I did have a video which I recorded yesterday that I was sort of happy with and was uploaded, but you know what? I felt I could make things a tad better, which probably means a lot longer. And despite people keep telling me that what I should do is cut and change pieces, I don't always like the way that goes with the flow. There are some videos where you can do that because they're sectional, so you can cut out a section and put in a new section. And some videos like this, they are discursive topics. Because a lot of these vessels, a lot of these ships which I'm going to be discussing, I have already done videos about it. I have already discussed in their detail. So if you want to go look at them, they'll be in the Key Ship series. Vast majority of these are in the Key Ship series. In fact, I was looking at the class and going, I don't think there's any which aren't. O-class Battlecruisers maybe, which are going to be covered. But I think that's about the only class which isn't covered in the Key Ships. And honestly, the O-class Battlecruisers, just imagine the Germans decide to play copy and paste with Renown and Repulse, but update it a little bit. That's basically your base point for the O-class Battlecruisers. It's updated and German designified, or German designified, or German designified, Germified? That sounds wrong. Germified does sound wrong. But, yeah, the O-class Battlecruisers are interesting. You could also say they are an upgraded 15-inch Battlecruiser variant of Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, which are, of course, battleships, but they are battleships which are fast battleships, but which are designed around 11-inch guns because the Germans can't build anything bigger than an 11-inch gun at that point, and they really, really, really want to build a battleship. Classic humans. They really, really, really want something, and so they build it. But they don't quite have the tech or infrastructure in place to build what they really, really, really want, so they have to settle for what they really, really, really want, but it's got 11-inch guns. Which then leads to an entire generation of people going, they're battle cruisers, and you're going, no, look at their design, look at their arm rear profile, look at their subdivision, look at everything about them. They are battleships. They're fast battleships, but they are battleships. They've just got 11-inch guns. And at no point in the entire history of battle cruisers, at any point was it a case of, yes, we are building ships which have less capable guns than their equivalent battleships at a time, and calling them battlecruisers. The only example you can possibly get that we'll be covering at this point are the G3s, but the N3s weren't being built. They were being built after the G3s, and the entire reasoning was, well, we want to not have them be quite so fat. We've got to keep their beam and everything sorted out so we can maximise the existing infrastructure without degrading the infrastructure. So yeah, they're going to have 16.5-inch guns. And 16.5-inch guns are a surprisingly popular gun once you start looking around for the historical records. For guns which never get used, they turn up a lot more than 18-inch guns do. And that's an interesting question. Why? Because, well, 420mm is a pretty decent weapon system. In fact, if I was designing a battleship or battlecruiser from scratch today, I would probably go straight for a 16.5-inch gun to build, because it represents a sweet spot. And people might go, well, what about the 16-inch gun? The 16-inch gun is very good, but the 16.5-inch gun is just that little bit better. Just that little bit better without costing or being that much more difficult to build. In fact, it's pretty much the same. And rate of fire wise, 16.5-inch will maintain the same rate of fire as a 60-inch. Whereas once you start going over that, due to the growth in weight of everything involved, the rate of fire will go down. Now, I do realise there are some interesting conversations. Sometimes I see comments, and I've been getting into a few of these by doing the Keyship com response videos for Christmas. The amount of people who confuse initial rate of fire with persistent rate of fire. I.e., they'll read something that goes, this could fire up to 2 rounds a minute. It can do. That's its initial rate of fire. After that, no, it's not going to get anywhere near that. I mean, there's like a couple of the 18-inch guns are a good example in that some of the cycle times that they were officially capable of versus they were actually capable of gets really interesting. So you have to always bear in mind that some of the stats we have, in fact a lot of the stats we have, are either remembered stats because all the technical details were destroyed, or technical stats from the technical manuals of people working it out and going, yes, this is what we are selling you, sir, this is what it will do. And you can decide for yourself whether you should always trust the salesman's figures. Whether the salesperson's figures are always correct. In my experience, usually the more they smile and say, trust me, the more I am inclined to think that what they're selling me is atrocious. But, saying that, this is part of what today's video about is. It's about looking at where ships and battleships and battlecruisers and cavalry ships were going at the points at which we stopped, because it's rather an interesting piece of history in that whereas with the age of sail and the big ships of the line coming to the steamships of the line, there's a point I can point to. I can point to one position in time and I can go, yes, that is when they stopped, and that is where we can sample all the designs, we can find the final thought process of what was happening, but didn't get built. And yet, conversely, in this era, when we're talking about battleships and battlecruisers, capital ships as they became termed in treaty eras, well, it gets a little bit more complicated, because there's literally a sampling point at the end of World War I when the treaty system comes in. Then there's all the, we're looking at it during the treaty period designs, to the ending of the treaty period while still limited by treaties. And I should probably point out, shameless book plug, please note the second edition, the paperback edition, is for sale, and thank you to everyone who supports the channel. Thank you to everyone who makes me being a historian possible. Thank you to everyone who's helped makes it happen. And thank you to everyone who buys my book. It really does mean a lot to a historian, and it means this was my first one, and there are more coming. They're being slightly delayed by various things in my personal life at the moment, but they are coming, and they will be good. They will be something I'll be proud of. But this is always going to be my first one, and so it's always going to be important. And I'm going to be very glad that I've recorded several hundred videos, I think it must be by now's point, with a shameless book plug with it pictured in it, because that will mean there's always that record of it next to me, should I ever need it. The German plans. The German plans. Well, these are the end of World War I plans, the ideas they were thinking of, what they were wanting to do. And you have the L-20 class battleship. A glorious beast. A really, really glorious beast. That was going to have 16.5-inch guns. 16.5-inch, 45 caliber guns and capable of 26 knots. I mean, this is the response to the Queen Elizabeth class. People often try and tell me the Bayern class is the response to the Queen Elizabeth class, and I go, no. The Bayern class is, if anything, is the response to the R class. That's it. That's what their equivalent number is. The response to the Queen Elizabeth class: speed advantage, armour advantage, firepower advantage. It's the L-20s. And is specifically going for 16.5-inch guns, because they are looking at the British and going, the next jump from them is going to be 16.5 inches, so we will beat them to it. Now, this is again another reasoning for my idea of why HMS Agincourt, the mysterious 6th Queen Elizabeth class, and there are videos about her on my channel, was going to be a 6 18-inch gun version of the Queen Elizabeth class, but we'll leave that to one side. The British did know what the Germans were developing, the British did understand it, and that would have been a very, very scary vessel. It's another reasoning for the British to respond as I think they did. Then you have the Mackensen class. Now, them and the Desert Yorks are not that dissimilar. But the Mackensons, they have 4 twin 13.8-inch guns and a top speed of 28 knots. The Desert Yorks, 4 twin 15-inch guns and a top speed of 27.3 knots. If you're looking at them going, well, hang on, the speed's starting to combine here of the German battleships and the German battlecruisers as their guns going up, and in terms of firepower, their armour, the survivability, and their speed goes down. You're quite right. This is the point I make quite often about a spectrum, and this is my big problem with the German Navy. They did not need battlecruisers. Battlecruisers were a bad investment for the German Navy. They really were. And the fact that they are working on 2 classes of battlecruisers but only 1 class of battleships at the end, to me, just shows some of the problems in the German Navy, in German hierarchy in the German thought process. Because the thing is, battlecruisers in German terminology, like their armoured cruisers, were always supposed to be second line for the battleships, were always supposed to be able to support the battle line, to make up for their lack of battleship numbers. So, the whole time you're focusing in on this, the whole time you're focusing in on battlecruisers, you are actually taking effort away from your battleships. And the thing is, if they'd been able to make all their battleships 26-knot ships, if they'd set up a battle line which from the beginning prized speed as well as armour and firepower, and had been pushing the speed envelope, which, to be honest, their engineering capability would have certainly made them able to do. Their engineering capability really could have pushed them to do. They would have been far, far more capable and far greater threat. Because if you consider it, focusing on engines, what is the other thing the Germans are producing? Liners. The area of greatest civilian overlap with their warship, with their aspirations for large naval ships, is liners. Is their commercial shipping, is their liners, their liner production. The British produce tramp steamers. The British have tons and tons of them, have a huge advantage in terms of merchant vessels because of it. But the German advantage is the quality of their liners, their ocean liners. And I think, for me, this represents a problem in the German thinking. Because the battlecruisers were never going to be fast enough to outpace the British battlecruisers or fight the British battlecruisers in that sort of way. Yes, you can say, well, the scouting group needs the battlecruisers to weigh in against the British scouting group. It does, but why does the scouting group fighting? The whole maxim for information is any information you need to fight for, you might as well not have, because you've told the enemy you have it. The Germans have Zeppelins, the Germans have all sorts of other things for reconnaissance. Why are they building an entire class of large armoured ships which take up a lot of infrastructure, a lot of industry, and a lot of resources, instead of using those resources to make better battleships that suit their needs more? And why are they copying the British? For me, this shows the fundamental problem with the entire German design program. It shows the problem. It shows where their issues come in. Because what they're getting into and what their issues are, mostly, comes down to the fact that they spend more time thinking about what the British are building and responding to that than they spend thinking about what they actually need. And nothing shows this more than when you look at this. When you look at these results, what the Germans were aspiring to do and could have done, and what the Germans were also building alongside it. And you sort of go, 27.3 knots. In a world where the Germans produce a 26-knot battleship, the British have 24, 25-knot battleships, a 27.3-knot battleship, a battlecruiser, is not a good thing to have. She doesn't have enough of an advantage. And in a world where the renowns exist, she's snookered. Because she can't go fast enough to dictate the fight to them. And she isn't armed enough to fight the battleships. Battlecruisers are all about using speed and the strategic powers that gives you in terms of being able to dictate range, dictate the pace of conflict, dictate the timing of conflict, to secure a decisive advantage. For that, you need a speed advantage of at least 3, if not 4, preferably 6 knots. In this time period, i.e. before aircraft become a major part of the world, and before missiles become a major part of the world, where things measure their speed in terms of movement of hundreds of knots. It's not sensible. So the Germans have their interesting plans. These are not bad ships. These are just not the ships for Germany, and they show the problem with the German thinking and the German thought. If whatever their thought, a train of thought is going at this point, they're producing ships for the sake of we are producing this, not why are we producing this? Do we need this? Is this a waste of time, effort, and money that we could be better spending on other things? Before you get in a whole debate of whether they should be spending on the army or other things like that, you can sort of think of going, well, even within the Navy, is this sensible allocation of funds? I thought people start jumping in the comments going, well, what they should have been spending on the submarines, etc. The submarine technology is even less in a good place. And if it wasn't for the fact that anti-submarine warfare was quite so still scrabbling along to try and grow, the submarines could have had a real problem in World War One. As it was, World War Two, there is a reason why in World War One the Germans come far closer to winning the war by submarines than they do in World War Two. As massive an effort as they do accomplish in World War II. And please note, I am not saying they do not do well in World War II when I say that. I'm saying that when you look at the whole intelligence strata and the anti-submarine warfare strata and all the things built up by the British and the Allies, In World War II, they mostly keep pace with the submarine threat. And as strong as it becomes, usually it gains that strength. Usually it gains that strength because of other circumstances. One of the big circumstances that goes when you sort of... Sometimes. Okay, if I give you an example. People point out there's a huge increase in, the kills of Allied ships in 1942-ish. And they're sort of going, well, is it the second happy time off the coast of America? Well, that is partially it, but that's a whole different other cauldron of problems to jump into. But one of the other big problems is, at a certain point, the Allies are stripping escorts from everywhere to protect the torch convoys and get them across the Atlantic without any problems. Which means they have less of the hunting groups and extra escorts to go around and support the convoys when they're under threat from German or German submarines. That doesn't mean the Germans have got better at killing merchant ships. It doesn't mean German submarines and submarines are suddenly more lethal. It just means that the counters which had been available and had been being used prior to that were off doing something else which the Allies judged to be of more importance at the moment. And the moment you go, well, hang on, but this is supposed to be a life or death struggle on the Atlantic and they're judging that as more important, it suddenly starts to make an entirely different opinion and picture of the Battle Atlantic, which was a very tough, very hard, very technologically focused conflict and very much human use of technology focused conflict, but wasn't quite as one-sided as especially a lot of the post-war propaganda about the valiant struggle and of the British and the cultural memory likes to quite make out. It was hard, and again, this is the thing, I can say this because I'm a few generations away, and whilst I lost family in it, they're not family I knew. Not personally. They are family from my grandparents' generation. They fought hard. I know the stories about them. But I also know when I start looking at the stats and I look at the convoys and I look at the stories, a lot of the stories and a lot of histories focuses on the convoys which were attacked, not the ones which were ignored or managed to get through without ever going anywhere near a German attack, a wolf pack. Austrian plans. Well, if you want a good example of someone as a nation, of a group of people as a nation, actually building to fit their criteria and their needs, you'd be hard-pressed to find better than the Austrians. Honestly. Possibly the Italians with the Francisco Caracola class and later on the Littorios. They really do, as two nations, the Austrians and the Italians do really push the envelope in terms of designing to fit their situation. The Austrians know that, frankly, nowhere else in the world matters if they can't first get out of the Adriatic. Unlike the Germans, who are obsessed with talking about battlecruisers, ranging far and wide across the world. Can you get your fleet out of the North Sea and dominate the North Sea so you can get out of the rest of the world? No. Oh, well then why the friggin' are you bothering about the rest of the world? You have to first get there before you can influence it. The Austrians go, we're good. But we have a rather large obstacle between us and the sea. Now, myself, as you will have noticed if any of you watch me on Twitch occasionally, when I do my Twitch streams in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, because I'm, working through that and I'm using that to explore and talk about some of the naval history there. I have been working with I've just started off with the Austrian campaigns, and one of the things that annoys me with the game is I'm not allowed to start by declaring war on the Ottoman Empire, because I'm fairly sure I could beat them. Instead I'm at war with the Russians, and I'm not sure I can beat them at that particular time. And the real problem for me is I can't get my ships out. I need to come up with a way of being able to get my ships out. and that's declare war on Italy, which is famously not an easy country to invade. It has a lot of mountains around the top, and it has people who are incredibly passionate, which makes them very difficult to cow in a fight. It's just really annoying. Even simulated game versions of them. But the thing is with the Austrians, they notice. They know they have to be able to get control of the Adriatic before they can get out. And that's one of the reasons why they build the navy they do. One of the reasons they focus on the size and shape of the navy they have. Because that's what a navy is for. And here's that Monarch class, or rather the Monarch class as it would have been. Because that means new, basically. Well, they would have been even more interesting and even more capable than the Tegetovs on that front. They would have been a really, really cool design. And the Austrians don't build many, but I think the reaction to them would have been intriguing. I have a feeling the reaction was already coming from the Italians, but first of all, let's talk about the Russians. The Russians use a lot of Italian technology when they're building their ships. They use a lot of British technology. But they do not go for super firing early on. And pretty much every single one of their classes follows a pretty similar structure, in that you will find them having 4 triple turrets on the main deck. Center line, that's it. And you can look at them and go, well, you're just basically building the same ship and variations thereof. Yes. Why? Because it works. Because it can accomplish all they need it to. Because they don't have the money for a lot else. Let's be honest, none of the Russian ships really want to stand up to a Japanese battleship at this point. They really don't. As many as they build, that's not going to happen. And they are nowhere near going to be having enough ships in service quickly enough to be in any way, shape or form a counter to the German fleet in the Baltic. So what are they looking at? Well, they want enough ships that they can cause anyone to worry about taking them on, because you might lose ships. It's sort of a risk fleet approach again. And they want to be able to dominate the Black Sea. Yes. Russia wanted to dominate the Black Sea. And that's what they're building the ships for. To dominate the Ottoman Empire. To dominate that particular area of water. To try and give themselves access to the sea and guarantee their access to the sea. Especially against smaller powers. And also, they want to do all that whilst moving at a technological pace which they can both afford and maintain. That's terrible. That's trouble. The most interesting scenario here, though, I've often seen is the Borodino class battlecruisers. And why do I consider them most interesting? Because I honestly think if they had actually been in service during the era of the Soviet Union, the Soviets would have developed a very different doctrine. I also could see that leading to a very different World War II battlescape for them, but also to a very different post-World War II for them. Because I think the trouble is with the Ganguts is they were quite so limited. The Imperator Nikolai is an interesting design as a battleships go. It's definitely an improved Gangut. But I would say the Borodino class, they offer some really interesting abilities to the Soviet Union as a capital ship. And I could honestly see the scenario being that if they have those in service as well, there becomes a very interesting argument, especially from the Japanese, about what they should be allowed, because they're worried about Russians and what they might get up to after the Russo-Japanese War, and therefore that could have an impact on the treaties, but it could also lead to see the Soviet Union actually brought into the treaty system, which could have all sorts of interesting effects in the interwar politics. And yeah, completion of a Borodino-class battlecruiser, that continued in service, would make that very interesting because of the speed differential. Now, whilst the Gangnet class, the battleships which did survive, had achieved 24 knots on trials, they didn't really manage to maintain that. And there is a reason why the Imperator Nikolai is a 21 knot battleship, as are the Imperatrica Maria class. The Borodinos were 26.5, 27 knot ships, armed with 12 14-inch guns. They would have been very interesting. They had better armor, they had better armor layout, all sorts of things have been done to improve these ships. If they've been completed, one or two of them, they could have allowed the Soviet Union to really reach out and affect the world, especially if you consider where they are would have likely to be based, and versus where the White Fleet, i.e. the those who resisted Soviet takeover and wanted to, in some cases, restore the Menshevik government, in others restore the Tsarist rule, where the White Fleet were and where they would have been based. It's rather interesting. And then we have Italy. The Italian response to the Monarchs is actually built. Well, you can see her launching. She's launched. Francisco Carioccolo class battleships. Probably the greatest what might have been's what ifs ever. Literally, if these are launched, France does not wait to replace their pre-dreadnoughts. They will be replacing them as soon as they frigging can. There is no doubt about that. B, there is no way that the Royal Navy has 23 knot official speed. Nelson and Rodney, there is just no way. Why? Because the Francisco Carioccolo class were 28 knot ships. And how can I be confident of that? Well, because when they were deciding whether to maintain 10 15-inch guns in 5 twin turrets, and you can actually see, if you look at the design, you can work out where that other turret was going to go, they realised they could only maintain it, have sufficient armour for what they were required, and the torpedo defence system, etc. they were putting in, if they sacrificed some guns. And in fact, it's even further than that, because originally it starts off as 4 triple turrets, then goes down to 5 twin turrets, and then goes down to 4 twin turrets, all to maintain that 28 knot speed. All to maintain that. They would have been excellent. They would have been fast battleships par excellence that could have allowed the Italians to dominate the Mediterranean. You know, you can only imagine what the equivalent Littorio would have been if these had been the baseline battleships of the Italian Navy when they were ordering them and designing them. Or if even 1 or 2 of these had existed. Littorios are good and scary enough as it is, Well, this is your baseline to build better than. And I've discussed that before, but what is this? Well, this is the Italians realizing, pushing for what, honestly, the Germans should have realized. The Italians looked at Metro and went, it's an enclosed space. Yeah. We can't get out of this enclosed space unless we fight our way out, can we? No. So there's no way we can avoid combat and use speed to avoid fighting. No. So what we need is enough speed to decide when we're going to fight. Yes. And enough armor and firepower to make sure the fight is decisively over when we want it to be. Yes. So that's what they're building. Honestly, this should be considered the fast battleship, and I have a theory. I honestly do believe that if the Francisco Caracola class are launched, especially if my suspicions about, and I have strong suspicions about what HMS Agincourt, the 6th Queen Elizabeth class, was going to be, because I have a feeling that the British were jumping on the 28 knots, etc. All those, they knew where everyone else was going, and I think they were going for a first fast battleship. But I have a feeling if the British hadn't delivered Agincourt, if peace hadn't broken out, if war hadn't broken out, and these things hadn't been cancelled, and these had been built first, then you could well be entering a period where post battleships built afterwards are called Caracola battleships. I could see that, because the new defining characteristics will be the moment this thing and these ships enter service will be, if you don't do 28 knots, you don't matter. Because this is the defining speed point now. 21 knots is 7 knots slower. Put another way. "28 knots is 33% faster than 21 knots. Which means you not only have a commanding speed advantage, you have a decisive speed advantage. You can not only decide when the fight can take place, you can practically do laps around the vessel. I honestly wonder if the Caracolas are completed with the British complete the N3s as they designed them. Because if these are still being built, if the treaty doesn't happen and these are still built, then I don't see that happening. The British could go, well, we have battlecruisers and battleships, and the thing is, they have to come to us, so the N3s we will build, because you could stick them in Gibraltar, and Gibraltar is blocked and sealed, and none of them are getting out through Gibraltar. And that would be completely correct. I mean, the N3s would shred anything which decides to try and fight their way through Gibraltar. But to be honest, you could do that with sufficient guns based at Gibraltar. Probably. The battleships just mean that you're not completely embarrassing Spain by adding such guns to Gibraltar. Because, let's be honest, the only dreadnought which is going to be more out of date than pretty much anyone else is going to be the Spanish dreadnoughts, or their tiny dreadnoughts. Which again I've done a video about, because they are tiny! The smallest dreadnought built. And we have Britain. Ah, good old Britain. N3s and G3s. Now, I have two suspicions about these designs when they'd actually been completed. One of those suspicions is that sea turret gets moved. Because whilst the G3s had started construction, the way they were constructing them, you actually could swap sea turret around, so it's kind of like the nail rod configuration from the G3 configuration to the nail rod configuration. And I could see that happening. I'm not a fan of the nail rod configuration. I prefer the F3 as a design idea, and you could also do that, conceivably. You could swing around the G3 design into an F3 design scale, with C being super firing over B and A. That's all possible. And all forward armament. I can see that happening before they're finished. It was already, these are the designs they've started building on, but there are certain things which are not firmed in place yet, even with the construction beginning. That might sound strange to you, but honestly, when you consider the way they're being built and what's being built into them, it makes sort of sense, because you've basically got a aft engine section, that's engines, that section, and forward fire weapons and primary weapons and fire control section. And because the fire control section especially is the superstructure, you can move that around. And the weapons section, well, yeah, there are mechanisms and framing to do with the turrets, especially the barbette rings. But if we look at this framing and the framing here, you can very clearly see that basically they could cut out the middle bit and they could put framing across there, and it would be fun. They can move them around. So I think it could work. It could be modified without much effort whilst under construction. And the fact that designs for the F3s are quite so available, the F2s, and the eventual Nelrod design is because they decided to try and make everything as heavily armoured as possible, whilst keeping them with the side limits, so they're trying to shrink down weight as much as possible. The G3s aren't as limited in the weight front. And then you've got the N3s, which are 18-inch guns. And are basically as solidly built as you can imagine. They are pretty much as close as you can get to a solid lump of steel that floats. They really are. It's quite scary in some ways because of that. Now, what does this show about the British? Well, two things. One, they don't want to have ships randomly blowing up again. They're not really keen on that. Whilst there might be an official report which was sanctioned by His Lordship Beatius, aka Admiral Beatty, First Lord of the Admiralty, there are enough in the Royal Navy who know what really happened at Jutland and have really studied it, that they do not want it happening again. And so the G3s are to an extent designed for that, but the G3s are more than that. They are the final generation really of battle cruiser design. They're designed with speed as a priority, and that's so much so that they've actually got 6.5-inch guns rather than the 18-inch guns, because to maintain speed, they need to be slightly narrower of beam. They need to be slightly lighter and able to devote far more weight to engine and horsepower. So that's what they do. But conversely, the N3s, they are slow but constant death. Their basic approach will mean that, how do I put this politely? So, anything you have that you can chuck at that is not going to have much of an impact. You're going to have to be slogging away for a while. And it's firing 18-inch shells. And they are massive. And the thing about an 18-inch shell is it's big enough that it only requires one or two of them to hit you, and you are really having a bad day. Now, at a certain point, it does get to be that putting any weight into armor is just providing something to detonate weapons coming in, and you might as well just put your efforts into subdivision of the hull and making it as watertight and as small a space as possible, so that, well, as honeycombed as possible, so that, frankly, any hit does minimal damage. And you can argue that once you're getting up above 18-inch guns, that pretty much is your only option. But still, you could theoretically fight them. The thing is, these are both represent the epitome of the technology available. You cannot have more of a battleship than the N3. That is a pure battleship from that end of the spectrum. That is something which is designed to fight and keep on fighting, take blow after blow after blow, and keep on fighting and wear you down and crush you. And the thing is, the G3 is designed to dance around you. It's got the full strategic mobility. I would say it's more of a battlecruiser one word than a battlecruiser two words, which were the traditional British constructions. But there again, the British have sort of every other generation. Well, it usually goes 2 generations of battlecruiser two words, 1 generation of battlecruiser one word in sort of their design patterning. And these are very much battlecruiser single word. They really are. Sorry. Had a doggy come to the door. They are... Well, this is going to shock people because Hood and the Admiral class are often held up as being these really ultimate fighting machines. And they are very good. But here's a bit of a secret about them. If I was going to put them on a spectrum, I would say, especially if you were building equivalent battleships at the time, they would fit more in terms of being a battle cruiser two words. Towards that end of the spectrum, this further end, you know, you've got the spectrum being battleship, i.e. HMS Dreadnought, the N3s, these sort of things, pure brawling battleships designed to take out and meet a huge amount of damage and keep on rolling. And you got the fast battleships, designed to take a lot of damage and keep on rolling, but also designed with the idea of going fast. So, you know, they have to accept they're not going to take quite as much as the ones down here, and probably not have quite as much firepower as the ones down here. Compromises, because unless you have infinite infrastructure and the ability to dock something which is infinitely sized, you're always going to have to compromise somewhere. Then there are battlecruisers, one word. Which, this part of the section, they are basically orientated around killing other battlecruisers, but also still being able to do the cruiser and strategic mobility role. And I would argue the G3s fit here. They are battlecruisers, but battlecruiser one word. And then you've got things like Renowned class and Hood. The thing is, because people are looking at 15-inch guns, you know, Hood has got 13 inches of armour, which is the same as a battleship that had appeared, whereas HMS Renown has 6 inches of armour. So she's built, you know, that class, they're built like the other traditional battlecruisers. And I would say definitely the Renown class are definitely battlecruiser two words, where they're designed from, where they're coming from. But I also wouldn't put Hood as necessarily battlecruiser one word. I would say her design is modified post-Jutland to move from being a battlecruiser two word, pure battlecruiser, strategic mobility, high speed, cruiser engagement, Battle of Falklands style scenario, towards something else, but is definitely not reached the level which you talk about when you talk about the G3s in terms of being a battlecruiser one word of that generation. And I think that's also a scenario you have to deal with a Hood, because people look at her armour and they go, well, you know, she's obviously is this, but she's not. They've taken a design which was orientated around one way, and they've cobbled stuff onto it to push it towards one thing. But this is why I talk about a spectrum, because I don't think it's quite reached that point. I think it's heading towards it, but it's not quite at the level which we call it a battle cruiser. But often, if I have to quickly define things, I probably would put it into that category, because it's closer to that point by the changes than it is to the original battle cruiser. But the thing is, the G3s are battle cruisers. That's what they are. This is why they're not fast battleships. That's another thing people don't go, oh, they would have been fast battleships. No, they wouldn't have been. Because that's your battleship. And to get to a fast battleship equivalent, you probably have to drop that down to 16.5-inch guns. Probably. And up the horsepower. Or actually, probably keep it at 18, possibly keep it at 18-inch guns, drop the armour a bit down, and get it up to add the horsepower. But either way, you're not going to get it anywhere near the speed of that. That's battlecruiser speed. The G3s are fast ships. They are scarily fast. Because they're supposed to be aimed at 32 knots. Well, if you watch this channel enough, you'll know that the Royal Navy's aiming for a certain speed. Whilst in terms of the Queen Elizabeth class, they aim high and shoot low. More often than not, they aim low and shoot high. You're designing this ship for 32 knots. Cute. The Nerods were designed for 23 knots. HMS Rodney is clocked going at 26 knots. This is according to the Germans. It's not the Royal Navy who admit how far she's going. It's the Germans who reckon they are being chased by her at that speed. And they only manage to pull ahead once they're going a lot greater than 26 knots. We only managed, the statement is, we only managed to start putting distance on once we were well past 26 knots. Now, admittedly, that's with a captain who was absolutely taking no quarter and not caring at all, one jot, about the damage he might do to his ship by pushing every single bit of horsepower and steam into the turbines he could get. Horsepower to the shafts and steam into the turbines to generate that horsepower he could get. Yeah. But then you sort of go, well, hang on, that's the similar hull technology which was going into these two. And, well, yeah. The N3s were supposed to do 23 knots. So that could have been a 26 knot ship. Lord help the L20. Because let's be honest, if the L20 had somehow come into existence, and an N3 had found it, and turned out that the L20 did not have a speed advantage over it, Lord help the L20. That would not have been a pretty fight. But with the G3s, let's add that on. Let's say you've got that sort of same sort of speed increase. You could be talking 3-4 knots. So you could be talking about that doing 36 knots. That'd be scary. I'd also add that no other class I know has as many myths around about their naming as the N3s and G3s. There are various ideas about what their names were going to be. Most of those ideas are absolutely twaddle. And when I say that, I mean that in the nicest way. Because I can trace back the ideas to some of the sources, and usually they're fairly good sources, but they're giving in vague terms, going, according to someone I spoke to, it was possibly going to be this, and this sort of this. And then in other sources which are copying them, have repeated and got more and more stronger, and then yet poor people on the internet going, that sounded wrong. Not poor people, how do I put this politely? Or rather, it's not so much poor as in financial, but poor people as in they have read a good book in earnest, and they're taking it in earnest view, and they're taking everything as solid, and they don't realise that this has been a classic case of academic whispers, for want of a better phrase. It's slowly increased into firm. Then you go look and go, no. For example, they were going to be called the Saint class. I did a whole video which took that down. They weren't ever going to be called the Saint class. There's reasons for not calling them the Saint class. For starters, the Royal Navy don't like saint names. It smacks of popery. But leaving that to one side, naming something for the patron saint of Ireland when Ireland was leaving the Union and no longer part of Great Britain. Not really something which the Royal Navy was going to do. Also, the whole naming things of places of a political thing, the Royal Navy had only just worked that out as really a good idea, and so far they had got to names of cruisers being given to being named for towns. Hence the Town Class Cruiser fun, and the sheer number of those, and some of the Sea Class cruiser names. But I think these would have been admirals. Maybe battles. Maybe you'd have got virtues, as in things like HMS Dreadnought might have returned again. I could see an N3 class being called N3s being called the Dreadnoughts. The name ship of the class being HMS Dreadnought again, because that would fit with HMS Dreadnought herself going out of service and the Royal Navy wanting to remind people this is the new Dreadnought sort of thing. I could see that. I'm using a lot today. But they would not have been going with Saint names. I'm sorry. And there's a video on my channel which goes into that in far more detail, but Saint names, there are various people which push it, but no. Honestly, the Royal Navy has barely even named ships St. George, let alone anyone else, and that was even when it was the English Navy rather than the British Royal Navy. They barely named things St. George. HMS London comes along more often than St. George. Now, why have I put this up here? Quickly, well, because I did my old thing, and I noticed I did this again, and I do it almost every time, so I thought I'd put it in as an apology. We have the American losses of the Washington Cherries, the North Dakotas, and the Lexington class. I do not know why, but I seem to have a mental block on occasion when I call this class the North Dakotas rather than the South Dakotas. I apologize. I don't know why it is. But, yeah. I have corrected things now, and it is back to the way it's supposed to be, and South Dakotas. But the point still stands, as I'm going to be talking through, and that the slides are correct, and will be correct when they are eventually uploaded to Patreon. But I'm going to leave the discussion in, because I don't think I can quite match the discussion. So I'm going to apologise. In that, when I say I can't match the discussion, I mean every time I've tried to add in a new bit to change it, it doesn't fit with the flow of the rest of it. So apologies. I do know what I'm about to be saying, where I keep talking about North Dakotas, is wrong. I, for some reason, put in North Dakota rather than South Dakota. I apologise for that. The reason I've left it in as is, and I've added in this bit to clarify before it begins, is because it loses too much of the flow of the discussion otherwise. So, sorry. Please bear with me. I'll try not to have it happen again, but this is now 3 videos in a row where I've called them North Dakotas rather than South Dakotas. And then realised afterwards that I'd made a mistake. Or when people have pointed out. I don't know why it is. I seem to have a mental block where they're concerned. Anyway, back to the US Navy's Washington Cherries. We have the American losses of the Washington Cherries, the North Dakotas, and the Lexington class. What always amazes me with both the G3s, the N3s, the North Dakotas and the Lexingtons is their similarities in some ways. I would say the Lexingtons are closer to the Admirals as they originally planned. I'd say they are definitely battle cruisers rather than battle cruisers. They are designed for scouting, for reconnaissance, and North Dakotas are going to be the impending doom that are going to wipe you out. That is what the North Dakotas are for. They are this solid battle line which the US Navy will push out and use their faster ships to find and locate you, and so that those things can come and destroy you. That is the entire US naval plan. If you consider it, the Navy's a sledgehammer, well, the North Dakotas, they're this. They're the head of the hammer. Lexingtons, they're the shaft. Or haft. Or various other things you can call it. They're what are going to swing the head. And it's a very balanced approach from the US Navy, really. It's an interesting design. Whereas the G3s were supposed to go out the world and clear the world so that the Royal Navy's, well, to an extent, Hood, Renown, Repulse, if they're still around, and the rest of their cruisers could clear the world's trade and free up space for their battle fleet to come and engage and destroy you. The American ships, well, the North Dakotas are going to lead that standard battle line. In many ways, start a new standardization, a new standard battle line. And the Lexingtons are going to make sure that battle line knows where to go. It's very much a Pacific war. We've got room to maneuver. And again, it's the same with the British. The British have a bit of a difference to the Americans in that they think they're going to have to fight in the Mediterranean. They've just had a fight in the North Sea, and they're intent on wrecking the German maritime infrastructure so the Germans will never come back and they'll never have to fight them again like they have before, and never have to mass their entire fleet on the North Sea to deal with it, because the German maritime infrastructure will never be strong enough to support such a force in such a scenario. But the British still know they can't afford to ignore the idea of fighting in closed spaces. The Mediterranean is far too important to Britain as a through route for their trade with the rest of their empire, and far too important as a room for manoeuvre and strategic manoeuvre through the rest of their empire for them to be able to ignore. It's one of the reasons why the Francisco Caracolas have such an impact if they're built, because suddenly you have to respond to that. The British have to respond to that just in case Italy ever turns into a problem, but they also have to respond to that because the French will respond to that, and if the French respond to it and the Italians are both in a speed race, the British will respond to it, and if the British respond to it, the British have to respond to it because of the French and their various connections. And the thing is that the French can have very changing and very mercurial approaches to international relations, which then leads up to the next problem, which of course is everyone else will then respond to that. Everyone likes to think it's, very straightforward and A responds to B, but often it's D responds to C, responding to B, responding to A, responding to G, doing something to F. There is a reason why dominoes are such an attractive, point of reference when talking about international relations. It really does get quite intriguing at times. Japan. Probably one of the most comprehensive fleets outlined when you have the treaties go through. In that they are the only ones where you can see not just 2 generations of construction, but 3 generations of construction up ahead. So again, it's one of the interesting things. Different nations have different habits when it comes to their construction. The British, it exists on paper to the last minute, and then they build. So you don't really know what they were going to build post G3s and N3s. You have no real idea. If anyone tells you they are certain they know what they were going to build, then they are, to put it mildly, lying. they can have predictions. You can base a prediction on where the British are going, what they're likely to build, and I think it would probably be a fast battleship type. I think it would be an 18-inch gun fast battleship type, but it could also be a 16.5-inch gun fast battleship type. That is a very, very strong temptation for me to go with. But the thing is, the British don't know themselves what they're going to build, so there's no way anyone else can predict what they're going to build, because if the British at the time don't know what they're going to build after they built the M3s, they're still, deciding what they're going to go through and what their results and policy, what their testing is going to be, so they definitely don't know what the results are going to be, so they definitely can't inform their construction that way. There is no way you can know. Just not impossible. But the Japanese have to plan further in advance due to their infrastructure limitations. They have to plan. They have to think things through. And that's where you have these classes. They want to get to the point at which they can build the number 13s. Number 13s are great ships. Really great ships. 8 18-inch guns and 30 knot speed. A number 13 is a very scary tool. A very, very scary tool. The Amagis, they are scary. Believe me, they're scary. 5 twin, 16.1 inch, 30 knots of speed. That's a scary thing, but that's a battle cruiser. The Tosas, the Keys. Oh, they're again armed with 5 twin, 16.1 inch guns. The Keys are fast battleships. The number 13s are fast battleships. Tosas are a battleship. 26.5 knot speed. Amagi are battle cruisers. Amagi would have been probably the last generation of battle cruisers the Japanese would have built. They would have gone all fast battleship out to that point, because again they're looking at the battle cruisers for them like the Germans, but for similar reasons, because they can never build enough ships, are going to be the second line and backing up of their battle line. In fact, you can argue the Germans got that idea off the Japanese, because the Japanese are the first to really sort of build their armoured cruisers with that in mind. And the reality of it has to be that the Japanese are heading in the direction of the fast battleship. That's why the last two classes, the first ones being built, are the Tosas and the Amagis. And they are battleship and battleship. And then you've got the first generation of fast battleship, which has 5 twin 16.1 inch. And then you've got the second generation fast battleship, 4 twin 18 inch. Now, please note, one of the things that often comes up, people go, oh, the Japanese couldn't have built those in the 1920s. I'm honestly not sure if the Japanese can get there, but let's consider, they've got the Tosas and they've got some of the Amagis under construction, but they're planning on building more of those Amagis. They want to have 4 of the Amagis, and 2 Nagatos, 2 Tosas, 4 Amagis, 4 Keys, and 4 number 13s. And they've got roughly 3 yards they can construct them in. And it takes roughly 2 years on each of those slips. So, if you consider the Tosas are about halfway through construction, they've got, collectively they're taking up 2 yards, and you've got the Amagis as well. And, okay, yes, you've technically got a 4th, I suppose. So you've technically got 4 yards you can build them in. Technically 4. Especially pre-earthquake. If you consider when you're talking about in terms of 1920s, I think you'd see most of these ships being built somewhere towards 1930 in terms of the number 13s. I think by the time you get to them, the 4 Keys nowhere near starting at this point. So let's say you start the 4 Keys in 1922. That would have probably taken you through to about roughly 1925. And then you might be starting the number 13s, which might be entering service somewhere in the region of 1928. And that's if everything goes to plan. And the Japanese don't try and build anything else, like aircraft carriers or anything else in the period. Now, some people turn around and go, well, hang on, Alex, they'll be dominating the slips, but they won't be on the slips for that long, then they'll be launched, and then there'll be... Trouble is, the actual yards themselves don't have that much depth of infrastructure. And this is one of the problems. If you have something which is your primary build and you're focusing on, you can build it. But even if it's not on the slip, taking up the slip space, if it's still your primary build, then what is on the slip is going to be taking longer. But if you try and divide your efforts between the two, neither is going to get built that quickly. So the Japanese are in a real bind. One of the big realities of the situation is their own infrastructure limitations. And the limitations of building infrastructure in Japan with their then technological level. And what do I mean by this? I'm not talking about technological level as in... I don't know, any of the phrases which sometimes go around, third world, second world, all that sort of level, which I don't really agree with in some respects. But I'm talking about technological level as in, compared to today's ability for Japan to adjust and develop their infrastructure to deal with their tectonic activity, their technological development in the 1920s is nowhere near as good. I'm not surprised. We're talking about a century ago. There's a lot of time to learn in that century, and a lot of technologies and supporting technologies and contributing technologies have been developed and sympathetic technologies that have been developed and systems which have been developed which should help them advance themselves in the meantime. But believe it or not, in the 1920s, it's not there. So, yeah, I don't see those being completed that quickly. But that, again, doesn't really matter. It gives us an idea of where the Japanese thinking is going. And the Japanese were a nation of time. And they were reacting in many ways with their construction to the American plans. And the thing is, the Americans had plans, but they had announced laws and statements and things of what they were planning to build. And that's very interesting systems. But the Americans hadn't given you designs, because again, the Americans have an infrastructure differential to the Japanese. They do plan slightly more in advance than the British, but that's because of the fact of the way their congressional system works at this point. Whereas for a large part, the Royal Navy can just drop their designs in front of the Prime Minister and the First Lord of the Admiralty. Please, not the First Sea Lord, the First Lord of the Admiralty, the Minister. And occasionally the Cabinet, or the Committee for Imperial Defence. They really don't have to deal with a lot of... how do I put this politely? In a phrase which is suitable to the setting, I think it's called Monday morning quarterbacking. Because we are talking about Americans, so we should use the American phraseology. Monday morning quarterbacking. Yeah, you should have thrown the pass that direction and done that move and that. Well, as anyone who's heard the history of Senator Tillman, and some of the things he got up to with his ships again, which have been featured in the Key Ship series, you'll know that US senators do like their Monday morning quarterbacking when it comes to ship design. And frankly, the US Navy has to be slightly more, this is what we're going to build, because if they don't, then their senators get upset and do all sorts of annoying things. So there's a differential going on there. Whereas the Royal Navy tends to just go, sorry, it's secret. Which can be code for, it is actually secret. It can be code for, we do not talk about that ever. Or it can be code for, we haven't decided yet, and we're not in a position, and don't feel like telling you that. We're waiting on data to come back from testing, and frankly, no. We're just not telling you. I would love to say that that was a bad thing and should go away, but I don't agree. Whilst I do believe firmly that the democratic process and representative process requires civilian oversight of procurement, I do also have a firm belief that when it comes to designing ships and specifying out ships, too many cooks spoil the broth. And I think, frankly, it should be a case of, this is what is recommended by the Navy, do you agree with it or not? And if you don't agree with it, fine, the Navy goes away and works out a different design. I don't think it should be a case of, well, no, what I would like is you to change this gun for this gun and this one for this one. Because the odds are, the representative doesn't know that information. And their staff don't either. That's always the other thing. They go, well, we have advice from our staff. And I go, have you met your staff? Because I have. I'm one of the people they call occasionally to ask when they don't know things. And I've had to explain some very basic stuff to them. So I honestly do not credit them the ability to work that one out. And please note, always happy to consult. My fees are very simple. You will find them through the same people who I do my TV work for, past preservers. Really nice people. So, France. Excuse me a second. No, they won't make you sick. Okay, that's better. That's better. Ugh. Sorry. I have to remember I have to try and make myself not think about the fact that A, they look like this, and B, the burn comes from them. Okay. We're better. Alright. So. The Normandy class and the Leon class. Now, I have to say the Leon class I prefer. I think the Leon class could have been an excellent design. The Normandy class, I honestly only can see the rationale of building them. It's kind of like the Ganguts and the Russian Dreadnought program. We need to have something. We do. So we're building this. If you can build the the Leon class with their 4 quadruple turrets, I do not see why you are building this. You can go infrastructure and all the other things, but honestly, France we better serve. I also think when you're building a 21-knot, 13.4 inch, well, 12 gun and then 16 gun setup, I do honestly wonder why you're doing it that way. I do. And let me explain why I wonder. They're building 13.4 inch guns, right? 16 inch guns are 400 millimeters. They're 406 millimeters to be honest, so 66 millimeters further along. 350 millimeter guns, an extra 10 millimeters, are not that far away, and you'd have 13.5 inch. 13.4 is chosen because it's a design they're already building, and they're obsessing over going with the French available guns. But the thing is, they're also designing a new, trying to design, flesh out their quadruple turret system and all sorts of things. And so they're limiting themselves to the 13.4 inch gun. I think if I had been France, especially considering the feelings of detente, etc. that were going on, I would have been tempted to go to Britain and go, can we have some 15 inch guns please? Been a very easy way to jump ahead. They could have If they wanted to go for a triple turret, they could have gone for a triple turret. They could have even gone for a quadruple turret and outgunned it. Imagine that. Imagine if they completed a Normandy class with 16, 15-inch guns. That would be a scary, scary vessel. Or rather, a Leon class would not 16 to 15-inch guns. A Normandy class would have 12. Sorry, Normandy class design. But the trouble is, for me, looking at these ships, is that the washing the treaty really does France a favour, because it causes them to stop their construction and actually work on themselves and build back better. You have the Dunkirks, you have the classes which follow on from them. They are really great ship designs. They are really good ship designs. Why is this going so wrong for the French? What is happening so wrong? Well, because they're building them, because they want them, but they're not actually thinking about what they need, and they're also not thinking about what anyone else is building. Because the trouble is, these haven't even entered service. They're 13.4-inch gun ships. They're able to 21 knots. And you're building them as your lead ships in a world where the Francisco Caracolas are going to be around. In a world where the R-Class are around, let alone the Queen Elizabeth. Bayern is around. If these had been finished off after World War I, and the G3s and N3s had ended service, everyone looking and going, what happened to you? We've got quadruple 13.4-inch guns on a cable 21 knots. So, in simple terms, all of these, and definitely these, and this, can all outfight you and outpace you, and dictate range and everything to you. Well, yeah. France is not a backwards nation. France is not a nation without good technological base. But France has even more problems with politicians and political interference in the construction than any other nation in this time period. And you can see that. And then you also have the fact the yards go off and do their own things. And sometimes this results in the ships actually being worse. Actually being worse than they were even designed. And yeah, you can argue that, the Italian battleships, they were 14-inch gun ships they were building at the time, and therefore, they had 10 14-inch guns in their broadsides, so, or, they have sometimes 13 14-inch guns in their broadside, I think. I'm going through various ones from memory. Yeah, you can argue all that. This is a 13.4-inch gun. And yes, one of them has 16 of those. And that's going to be scary. And if you can actually get a rate of fire appropriate to its gun size, yes. But the fact is, these ships, and you could argue from the Normandy class, were outgunned by the Orion class, which are beginning of largely the second generation of British dreadnoughts, let alone their American and Japanese counterparts. The French are perhaps being a nation, guilty at this point of being a nation of great momentum, if not great thought and thinking it through. But there again, there are worse. Okay, Plan Z. The plan that has launched more books, and more papers, and more headlines, and more statements on the internet than it ever launched ships. Please note, I have just put in the stats of the actual H-Class, which are actually plausible. I've done a whole video on the H-Class and gone through the various design iterations. Once again, the 16.5-inch guns show up. What can I say really about this designs and this plan structure? The Germans are once again manufacturing in some ways a risk fleet. And their ships would have been powerful and capable vessels. But, and I say this in the nicest way, work through the maths. These ships were barely under construction, not even really started, when Bismarck and Tirpitz were still being finished off, when the British were already building Lions, which had 9 16-inch guns and speed of roughly 30 knots. Yes, you have the O-Class with its 3 twin 15-inch guns, capable of 35 knots, which would have been a good reason to keep Renown, Repulse and Hood around for a while until enough vanguards and MSOs, or until someone built an even fast battleship. But still, there is a small problem. For those battlecruisers to get anywhere in the world, they will have to get past the fast battleships. And they're now existing in a world where there are aircraft carriers, and there is land-based aircraft as well, and those aircraft will be able to probably find them and report their positions in. And it doesn't require a lot of them to find them, it just requires one sighting and one constant sitting of bearings, and then they can be motored in on. And you can go, well, they can go faster, they're 35 knots, the other ships might be capable of only 30, 32 knots. That's true, but you can only go that fast whilst you can go somewhere else. If you think, if I'm here, and I want to go over there, and I want to reach there, to get to it, that's quite a big distance. If the defender is, let's say, here, I should really have left something there, but I haven't got anything to put there. Iron brew bottle. Wrong position. Nope. No, doesn't really help. Okay. Okay. Let's say the target is the iron brew bottle, which is, for my benefit, is above my head. And the attacking ship is over here. And that's the O-Class, and that can do 35 knots. So it can get very fast. But if the defender is here, I want to go fast, that's always got to cover less distance to converge. And if you combine with the presence of aircraft and their strikes, suddenly your 35 knots is not fast enough. There is a reason why the nation, which was the most focused on strategic mobility and capabilities of battlecruisers, is not building battlecruisers in the run-up to World War II, is not looking at battlecruiser designs. They're looking at fast battleships, because they can't go fast enough now. There is now no way of avoiding that cutting down of space and having to fight the battle. And if you have to fight, you need the armour to fight with. And that's when you get into Plan Z, because if you consider the H-39 figures, well, 4 twin 16-inch at 30 knots versus the Lions, 9 16-inch at 30 knots. The thing is, you start to realise very quickly that the German designs are incredibly conservative, that whilst they get pushed up, there is a limitation to what their infrastructure and industry can actually produce, and that limits them and limits their abilities to respond to things. And that's not a bad thing. It's not good for their industry. It's not saying anything nasty about them. And it's exactly what the British had planned after the Treaty of Versailles. That is exactly why the British put in the clauses they do into the Treaty of Versailles and insist and push those things through. The British aren't after reparations. The British don't want they like them, but they're not really bothered about them. The British aren't after a lot of the things which the other allies consider mightily important, but the British will support them in getting those things as long as they give them what the British want. And what the British want is German maritime infrastructure industry crippled. And that's what they do. So, Plan Z. Well, the O-Class are a division of effort, which frankly you don't need. The only good advantage about them is if they use the 15-inch guns, which are being fitted to Bismarck, Tirpitz, and going to be retrofitted to Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. That's going to reduce your industrial requirements a lot. But, wow, suddenly you're building things with 16-inch guns. And then it's 16.5-inch guns, and then it's 18-inch guns, and Lord help them if they built all of them. The logistics nightmare would have crippled that fleet. Again, that would have been doing the British job for them, but you know, you can't expect the enemy to give you all the victories just because they forget about logistics. We have Japan. So, yeah, the Japanese go from having one of the most well-rounded approaches to naval construction to the Yamato class, and then the A150s. And basically, their entire remedy for their limited infrastructure and therefore limited ability to build, and their limited numbers therefore in counterpart to their prospective opponents, is to build the ultimate weapon. There is a small trouble with building the ultimate weapon. There is just a small issue with the ultimate weapon. Rarely stays the ultimate weapon for any length of time. I'm sorry, I can't not say ultimate weapon in a normal way. It's just something I find such an annoying point. Ultimate weapons don't exist. You have the weapon of a generation. You have the weapon which sets up the standards, but you don't have anything like an ultimate weapon. Now, I guess someone's going to point out nuclear weapons below and talk about them, and yeah, they're very powerful, but what's the counter to them? Other nuclear weapons. Destroying the launchers. The fact that if you do use them, you do so much damage that you actually risk destroying yourselves as well, those tend to cause issues. Those tend to cause issues with their use. So therefore, they are not an ultimate weapon. They will not necessarily allow you to win, but they just won't stop. They will just stop you losing. Or rather, they won't allow you to necessarily win, but they'll stop the other person winning. And you can both lose together. Because for some people, that's actually a preference to the other side winning. Both sides losing. However, the real problem with ultimate weapons when they're like this is that someone will build a counter. Someone will do. Because they always do. It's anything you can come up with, someone else can come up with something better. They might not be in the current generation, it might be next generation, but they'll think it through. And the trouble is for the Japanese is, let's say they do build these. Let's say the Yamatos are built, and the war doesn't start, and they build these. And they have 4 Yamatos and these vessels, or 2 or 3 of them, and they announce it to the world. It gets out to the world. Because the longer they have them before war starts, the more likely it's going to get out to the world. What's going to happen? Well, the Royal Navy is going to dust off its plans for its 18-inch N3 and 16.5-inch G3, and it's going to start working on something souped up from that generation, probably to fit its current infrastructure. And the US Navy is also going to do the same. And because of their infrastructure base, because of their industrial base, they will probably churn something out in no time which will be bigger and better and more numerous than what the Japanese can build. So actually, for the Japanese, pushing the tech flow as far as they do, in many ways this is going to cause them more trouble. It could buy them short-term safety. But the trouble is, the amount of investment and long-term overriding criteria it's going to require to get it there is never going to provide justification, will be justified by the short-term security it's going to provide in response. Because yes, the Japanese, and I've talked about this in Yamato class, if the Japanese had announced them to the world when they launched them, and when they, that would have heightened tensions. If they announced them to the world and they held off war until they were ready, and then they announced and showed them off the world like, these are our battleships, the best they can hope for is force the Americans to withdraw their battle fleet from Pearl Harbor. Maybe force various allies to back down, but that will be a short term. Because ultimately, they're in the same problem, same bind, same boat as Germany. It's infrastructure. And people tend to point out, well, Britain's also an island nation. They've got issues. Yeah, they have, but they've been investing in infrastructure for a long time, and Britain doesn't have, touch wood, the same tectonic activity as Japan suffers. So they have the same reasons as Japan to invest in infrastructure without the same geographical, aka tectonic, limitations. It makes for a difference in circumstances when it comes to infrastructure. The US Navy. The US. Now, this is one of the reasons and one of the areas where I came up with my sort of talking about the capital ship spectrum. Because the Montana class are a great example of that. Because at a certain point, their designs start to range from battleship, as in solid battleship, to fast battleship. It's kind of like the Iowa design ranges from, especially some of the paper designs, range from fast battleship and solidly fast battleship to, this is honestly starting to look like single-word battlecruiser. And they're on that sort of spectrum. And I often think that if the Montanas, especially some of the solidly battleship ones, have been built, then people would really be arguing whether or not the Iowas are battle cruisers. Instead of just calling them fast battleships, which I would say, honestly, they probably are. Or at least closer to that on the spectrum than they are to battle cruisers. Now, it's the US Navy, because they've got a good, solid doctrine for their capital ships. And basically the Montanas are just taking the role of the North Dakotas. And the Iowas the role of the Lexingtons. That's it. They're updated, but that's what they are. This is the new solid battle line. Lord help anyone who tries to cross it. This will crush you. It works. Sometimes people think being smart when it comes to procurement is innovative and ideas and off-the-wall, suggestions and policies. But no, sometimes being smart is boiling your systems down to what will work for you and going with it. Whether it's simple, straightforward, or whether it's complicated. What works for you? And usually simpler is better, because less can go wrong. And the US Navy is basically setting itself up as this heavy, mailed fist which will go across the oceans and crush. You might win rounds, you might win skirmishes, but they will keep on coming back again and again and again and again and again, and you will never win. That's it. And that's what the Montanas and all their battleship designs really are about. The fact they will never allow you to win. They will keep coming again and again and again. And they really do typify that, because they're designed to take a pounding and keep on fighting. Nothing more you want from Battleship, really. Similar policy. But the British have a little bit more of an issue than the Americans. Speed always matters a little bit more to the British on a strategic level. Why? Because the British Empire crosses the entire world. The Americans have to worry about the Atlantic and the Pacific. And to be honest, the Atlantic they don't have to worry about that much, because whilst people like to go around, do you know in the 1920s and 30s the British and the Americans had war plans for fighting each other? Yes, they did. They're the two most powerful nations on Earth at the time. If they didn't have war plans for fighting each other, it'd be wrong, but it would be very derelict of their duty, considering they're then the biggest threat to each other in terms of raw military fighting power. But also, if they didn't exercise as if working out how to fight each other, then they'd be exercising to fight, what, second-rate powers? That's the other first-rate power in the world. That's who you plan to fight against. Consider America likes to do exercises occasionally against allies and all sorts of things, and occasionally they simulate wars where they're going to fight really advanced technological opponents, and sometimes they, there was famously exercises against, where they simulated fighting against Israel, and they got themselves into real trouble, and you learn more from those exercises. So of course they have war plans for fighting each other, of course they have these things, they're good staff work and good staff exercises. Doesn't mean they're ever likely to be used. Okay? The thing is, with Britain and America in the 1920s and 30s, they're always talking to each other. They are always talking. And they're always exchanging people. And people are always going backwards and forwards and talking to each other. There is always non-stop talking. There are non-stop meetings. Frankly, trying to track the diplomatic exchanges between Britain and America, informal and formal, in the 1920s and 30s, is a good exercise in driving yourself insane. Because of the sheer amount of names and mundane meetings going on. At one point, there's the fact that the British ambassador to America, and I forget which president it was in the 20s, but it was one of the ones who really liked golf, and the British ambassador was one of his favoured golfing partners. So technically the British ambassador was getting together with the US president, sometimes on a weekly basis, for a round of golf. Anyway, according to one of my colleagues, friends I've worked with over the years, who is actually a diplomatic historian, these weekly golf matches were full of discussions and often included various members of the Navy, etc., from both sides going on, because the British naval attaché would come along, and sometimes various US naval officers would get invited. And it was just the thing they were doing. They were going and playing golf. I think they might have also been playing golf. Is it the Marine base or the US Navy base near Washington where there is a golf course? It's a whole level of area of history which, please note, it's not really my area, so whilst it's adjacent to my area, so I need to know, I do like to learn and listen about it, it's not really something I'm going to pay a massive amount of attention to. And because there's only so much brain space up there, there are some things which I just have to go, right, and that's a really cool fact, write that down in a book, and someday I'll refer to it, but please don't expect me to remember it. And the story goes that on one of the golf matches, the president was just sort of tortured away and went, "Yeah, so I've just been through our war plans. Yes, apparently Halifax is the critical place." And the British ambassador looked back to him and went, "I do believe ours say the same thing." Have you ever visited Halifax? No. It's cold. Yeah. If that's the critical place, we're both in trouble, aren't we? We could do with investing some more there. We'll try and make use of it. You'll try. That is the level of conversation which they were really getting to. So, how serious are war plans under those circumstances intents for war when it's one thing that both sides can figure out the same places are going to matter. It can do. And the race is always going to be, in that scenario of between war plan, red, etc., is the race to Halifax. Whoever secures Halifax first probably wins the war, as far as the needs of the war go. unless you want it to be a long ongoing war. And the thing about the Americans was they realised a long ongoing war against the British could be really problematic, because the British are the only power who could probably challenge them on both coasts and force them to divide that fleet. And remember, their entire idea is their fleet comes and it keeps on going. So is the British. But the British have some very fast ships, which means the Americans are going to have to either break up their fleet to cover all the places where those ships can go, or concentrate their fleet to try and focus in on the British fleet, in which case they have a logistics line to defend, which is a perfect target point. Fighting between the two is a good way to absolutely shred each other and cause a massive problem for the world, and cause themselves a lot of problem for not much gain in the end. But the thing is, both sides know this, and they're joking about it with each other. And how serious are war plans in terms of their intent, rather than their practice and the seriousness of actually approaching and figuring it out, because of the need to understand, because that's the best, as in the most capable enemy to try and think about fighting a war against, so it's the one you want best prepared to fight against, because even though you don't think you're going to fight against them, they are the best prepared. If you're able to fight the Americans, you can fight anyone. For the Americans, if you can fight the Brits, you can fight anyone. How serious are war plans if they're joking about them over a round of golf? I don't think they're that serious. And then you find out that the reports, going back to British and the things, is that was only a postscript note in the ambassador's next summary. Didn't even report the individual meeting. It was a monthly summary going back or something like that. And I was just listening to my friend relate the story and just going, yeah, that sums up my reading of the various war plans for the British against the Americans and the Americans against the British. It's completely, they are really academic planning exercises, and when you look at senior officers, the way they would go through them, they're making, most of the notations seem to be more about the process of the planning and how it was approached and how the information was organised, versus the actual content. Whereas when you're looking at war plans versus Japan, war plans versus Italy, war plans versus even France, it's far more about the content than the process. So yes, this is the Lion class, and I wish these had been built rather than the King George V's. Honestly, you could replace the King George V's with 15-inch guns and I'd be happy. Because at least those would be 15-inch guns off the shelf. You know, you could go with the 15-inch 50s, which were designed for the F3s as combination Nell rods. And again, you can argue that the 15-inch 50s and Nell rod design, F3 design rather than Nell rods, which would have been faster ships, would have been a really interesting spanner in the works for many nations if those two ships had been built. Because Britain having two brand new 28-knot battleships in the 1920s and 30s would have changed a lot of calculations. Especially when you consider, again, take that 23 knots, that's roughly 26 knots, take that 28 knots, same hull form, but with the power and the necessary turbines and shafts to go more than 23 knots or 26 knots, and work it up, and suddenly Scharnhorst and Gneisenau are having significant emotional events, or rather, at least Gneisenau is with Romney. And you get a whole different scenario being necessarily baked through into various battles. But a Lion class, fast battleship, 9 16-inch guns, 30 knot speed, if that's the baseline the British are building from, post the King George V's, those are not going to be bad ships. Yes, you can see it is typical British structuring and British styling at the time. You've got all these sort of mirrored superstructures. You've got defensive weaponry sort of around the centre. You've got the aircraft facilities in the centre of the ship, rather than having them at the aft, if you like the Americans or other interesting spaces. I honestly think they're not going to be around for a long time. One of the interesting things with the British is that in terms of aviation capabilities for their capital ships, it's really something they're already thinking about deleting them in the late 1930s, and if the treaties hadn't been around, I'm honestly certain that they wouldn't have continued it. It would have all been carrier based, because for them the whole scenario of sticking the stuff on the capital ships is just, well, it's adding extra flammable materials to the capital ships, and it's a waste of space for the capital ship to do most of its duties. Yes, the aircraft are probably the best advantage you can give to a capital ship in terms of spotting, especially prior to radar. And let's be honest, the most powerful weapon at the disposal of an aircraft is a battleship for most of the period. It's one of the strange things. People often negate spotting and go, oh yeah, that's silly, that doesn't matter. So you go, well, if you consider the sheer amount of firepower that can be delivered accurately within the range of a battleship's guns, very accurately if an aircraft spotting, versus that aircraft dropping its maximum load of bombs, then having to fly back to the nearest carrier or aerodrome, reload and come back again, or torpedo and reload and come back again, versus the sheer amount of shells which can be deployed very quickly and very efficiently by this shell dispensing unit. It suddenly starts dawning you that it really is a powerful system. But the thing is, what's its advantage being carried specifically on the battleship, on the capital ship, versus being on the carrier and part of the carrier air group? Something you need, whilst the carriers are limited in number, and the carrier air groups are limited by the size limitation, total tonnage limitation of your carriers. And remember, again, with the British, the Americans, and Japanese, and all the nations building carriers that are applying the treaties, they have to make a judgment call: survivability of the carrier versus amount of aircraft that can be carried. And depending on where you're fighting and how you're planning on fighting and how you're planning on using your carriers is going to depend on where you end up making that judgment call. If you are Britain looking at fighting on the other side of the world from your infrastructure base, or fighting in the Mediterranean, or fighting in the North Sea, or anywhere in the world as far away from the infrastructure as you can be, the South Atlantic or the Indian Ocean, compared to where British infrastructure is that can repair and fix aircraft carriers, let alone build aircraft carriers, well, you want to make your ship as survivable as you can within limitations, as long as it still carries a viable air group. You also have the British issue that whenever they try doing deck parking in the 1920s, the North Sea has a habit of going yump. That's the other thing. You get into this whole discussion of air group size, and people going, well, yeah, you deck park, we include deck parking, and the British include deck parking by the time they get in the Pacific War, and people go, yeah, that's Britain modernised. No, it's not Britain modernised. It's Britain operating in a place where you can do deck parking without losing your aircraft. At one point in the 1920s, the biggest cause of loss of aircraft for the Fleet Air Arm was the sea. Because of one incident. So, yeah. Sorry, laughing so hard I'm hiccuping. But it's a really interesting idea, where are the British going? And then you've got, of course, the Vanguards, which are also fast battleships. And you've got the King George V's, which are fast battleships. And that's the idea. The British are going along the lines of, right, we're building all-rounder ships. We're going for the fast battleship, as that's a portion of the spectrum. But it's fast enough to do the jobs we need. And for the ships we need really fast, well, that's where an aircraft carrier and its aircraft can come in. That's what that can do. We need the really high-speed movements. And that can replace the battlecruiser. But that's slowly phasing in, and we've got some battlecruisers to cover till that time that's viable. And, well, then we have the Soviet plans. Okay, so, let's be honest, base point entry into the club for having a decent battleship in the late 1930s, early 1940s is probably 9 16-inch guns in 3 triple turrets and 28 knots. I mean, the 8 on the H-39 is probably there, balanced out by speed, etc. But you're talking 16-inch guns, you're talking 28 plus knots. And then you've got battlecruisers. Kronstadt, 32 knots. Stalingrad, 35.5 knots. One has 3 twin 15-inch guns, one has 3 triple 12-inch guns. I would argue that the Stalingrad class in many ways remind me almost more of the Alaskas in terms of their role and duties and their profile. But the Alaskas, in many ways, as I've often argued, are actually not battlecruisers. Then there's a reason that the Americans never call them battlecruisers. They're not battlecruisers. They are where heavy cruisers really should be. They're kind of like the Deutschland class. They are where heavy cruisers should be in this time period if there hadn't been for treaties. That's where the heavy cruiser would probably be sitting around. You would have the light cruisers, which had 6 and 8-inch guns, depending on what role you want them to do. You'd have a heavy cruiser with 11 or 12-inch guns, and then you'd have your capital ships up on probably something around 16 to 18-inch guns, if it wasn't for the treaties. And you probably have some really, really interesting one-offs with 20-inch guns, etc., until someone has realized that actually trying to use a 20-inch gun is self-defeating. Again, I've done some videos about that, and I'm going to do some more videos about gun technology at certain points. And the thing is, with a 20-inch gun, it's its rate of fire. You need a certain rate of fire in order to be able to compute quickly enough where your target is going, because how you improve your accuracy of your fire is by watching a fall of shot. And if your enemy is able to fire 3 salvos for every one you fire, they will tend to find you, start hitting you before you hit them, unless you're incredibly lucky. No matter how accurate your system is, you're not going to. The odds of you getting a first salvo hit are not in your favour. They're just not. No matter how advanced. People sometimes write things going, oh, the Yamato class was so advanced in their long-range fire technology. They really were advanced. Getting a first-round hit is not going to be their case. It's going to be a few salvos in. And in the nicest way, if I'm firing 6 20-inch guns, and so I'm firing 6 shots a salvo, and I'm firing at a rate of, in terms of persistent rate of fire rather than initial rate of fire, a salvo every 40 seconds. Not being rude, that's 3 salvos every 2 minutes. And my opponent is firing a salvo every 25 seconds. Not 20 seconds, every 25 seconds. Then in my 120 minutes, 120 seconds, or rather, let's go up to 240 seconds, I will have fired, let's say, 6 salvos, and in 240 seconds, well, rather 225 of them, they'll have fired a lot more. They'll be at roughly 9. Now, you can go, well, what about the initial salvo? That's the 0 point, and you can add that on and go, yeah, that's good. That gets you 2 rounds a minute in the initial rate of fire, because they have a salvo ready to go. Because that's how some people account for initial rate of fire. Before anyone starts critiquing me going, our reputable website doesn't. Yes, I know. Several reputable websites do not, and some reputable websites actually separate out the two. But some less reputable websites do consider the initial rate of fire and just use that as the example, and that's when people get their rate of fire. And some books do the same, and some historians do the same. Why? Because they are very good historians often, but the tech stuff is not really something they dive into. So, what are Soviet plans here? Well, they've got a decent battle cruiser, they've got a decent battleship, and they've got a decent heavy cruiser. And their plans are to develop a decent, balanced fleet to try and project Soviet influence. The fact is that there was no chance of them getting those finished anywhere near any time soon. Is neither here nor there. The fact is that's what they wanted, and that's what they're working on. Why? Because they wanted to be taken seriously as part of the big nations club. And they might say they wanted to change the wheel, they wanted to break the wheel, they wanted to change the world, but actually what they wanted was a seat at the table. That's what they wanted. And that's what Stalin wanted. He wanted a seat at the table because he saw security in having a seat at the table. And so that's what he's pushing for. That's what he wants. And that's what he sees the Navy as his methodology to get. A seat at the table. And so, that's what he's pushing through. I had some fun with AI. Image generation. It was cute. This is a future battleship, apparently. So, what are we talking about? What have we been talking through? Well, this entire discussion of video basically boils down to, and the reason I'm re-recording it is because I'm delaying it till probably Wednesday, is that life is not simple and straightforward. And sometimes you can learn more about what people were dreaming of building than what they actually built. Because when you build something, you have to compromise. You have to compromise with reality of your infrastructure. You have to compromise with the world as is. You have to compromise with what you want with what you can get. A good example is Sharnos and Gneisenau, which wanted to have 15-inch guns. They could have 11-inch. Because that's what they could get. So, these fleets, these ships which were not built, they tell us a lot about what those nations wanted. And about how those nations felt. What they dreamed of. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you found it useful. Alright, so what else have we got coming up? Viewer suggestions number 4. I'm still taking suggestions for that, and that's the 31st of October. And that's the last viewer suggestion Tuesday video of the year. But remember, it's the year of technology, so it is supposed to be within that theme. And I really do, I always say this, viewer suggestion, can you please write that in your comment, which is a viewer suggestion? Because it makes it so much easier to me to track down. It used to be, when I first started doing viewer suggestion, that I honestly got so few comments it was very easy to spot through and spot them and read them all and go yeah. But sometimes I honestly don't get around to reading all the comments till I do a comment response video on a channel, on a video, and sometimes I just read the comments which ping up to me and I haven't looked down and see them and they catch my eye. So viewer suggestions, so I can do the quick search and go viewer suggestion to enter in the search thing, and then it pops up. Then I'll know exactly that is definitely a viewer suggestion for a topic, and I can be fair. And I'd really love to hear what your suggestions are. Thank you very much for watching. That would be next Tuesday's video. And what have we got coming up live-wise? Well, this is coming out on Wednesday, so it will be Battlecruisers and Battleships are separate categories in the Washington Naval Treaty. Appropriate one for this video. Thank you very much for watching, and take care. I'm hungry. I think I ate all my chocolate bars. That's annoying.